How many decisions do we make in a given day, by the way?
Thousands, probably.
Thousands, probably. Do I have a better offer? 200. This is going down. It's a Dutch auction.
Well, it's like Groundhog. It's like a bit like Groundhog. When you get to my age, it's like Groundhog Day. So every day's very similar. So it's not many new to see. You're on automatic pilot a lot of the time.
Possibly. Yeah. But 200 decision is right about food. We make about 200 decisions about food only.
Oh my God.
Every day.
Wow.
But the overall number of decisions we make in a given day, and the gentleman is right, it's about 35,000.
Oh my God.
It's huge, absolutely huge. So we do struggle from time to time, and that's probably what decisions want us to do. Think of where the word decision comes from. Any idea? It comes from the word in Latin, caedere, which means to cut out, to cut off. So there's something quite violent about the act of deciding, so no wonder we struggle from time to time. And of course what we're cutting ourselves off is another option, and that feels painful, doesn't it? In the mind, and psychology has proven that, associates that with a feeling of loss, with a feeling of suffering, and of course we're prepared to do anything in the world to avoid that so we don't decide. If we go back further in time, we go to ancient Greece. Soon we'll be in ancient Egypt. And in ancient Greece, the word for decision is also quite revealing. It is crisis. So maybe what decisions want us is exactly that, to experience what that crisis is about and how we overcome that crisis. Now we all know that in the real world, in real life, the way we should deal with a crisis is certainly not by panicking, but trying to understand the roots, trying to understand where it comes from and deal with it with a quiet, calm mind. And that's what makes us better decision makers. So our journey together this evening carries on with the most famous procrastinator probably in Western literature. Who are we talking about? Any idea? Hamlet, thank you. Hamlet, I mean, think about it. The man knows that his father was killed by his uncle, who then married his mother, and despite knowing that, he still can't decide whether he should kill him. Yeah? So let's think about Hamlet. And interestingly, one of the most famous lines in theatre comes from Hamlet. And of course you know what it is. It is a choice. To be or not to be, that is the question. That's not what Shakespeare wrote. That's not the first thing he wrote anyway. That's the third version of Hamlet. In the first version, what's known as the first quarto, Shakespeare has already answered the question. So the line is not to be or not to be, that's the question. The line says, to be or not to be. There's the point. So what Shakespeare is saying is the point of being human is not whether we decide A or B, is not whether we decide to be this or not to be that, is not whether we decide to do something or not to do something, but it's the fact that we can decide. So what this says is that really decisions are not so much about the outcomes, is it A or B, is it to be or not to be. It's about how we face them. This is really what matters most. Aristotle wrote 17 centuries before Shakespeare, don't judge a man by the outcome of his decisions, judge a man by the intentions behind his decisions. So I think that's a source of growth for all of us. So this illustrates another fact, that the opposite of a decision is not the opposite decision. We're not in the binary world of to be or not to be. The opposite of a decision is renouncing. Again, Camus wrote that, not me. The opposite of a decision is renouncing. It is indecision. Good evening. So, let's go back to Hamlet for a second. Obviously, Hamlet is not a comedy, it's a bloodbath. The technical term is a tragedy. And Aristotle, again, had coined the perfect word, or used the perfect word, to define what tragedies have in common. And the word in Greek is hamartia. I promise I won't speak more ancient Greek tonight. I'm not Boris Johnson. Definitely not. But what does hamartia mean? I'm sorry, I realize now that this is recorded. My future in politics is in danger. So what does hamartia mean? Hamartia means self-estrangement. And that's probably the main thesis in the book, is that the main reason behind our indecision, behind our struggle to decide, is hamartia, is self-estrangement, is the distance we have taken from the self. So self-estrangement can mean two things. Either the self is hiding, I don't know who I am, a lack of self-awareness, or I am hiding from the self because I don't like who I am, lack of self-acceptance. So when you think about it and think of your own struggle with some decisions you make in life, could it be the reason, could it be the source? Lack of self-awareness or lack of self-acceptance? Because we're never going to be able to make our best decisions if we suffer from these two things. So the first sign of self-estrangement, the first manifestation of self-estrangement is what we call a lack of self-continuity. So that's actually a word, an expression which comes from psychology, and in particular from a professor called Tim Pitchell. And what he means by that is the lack of continuity between my present self and my future self. So what psychologists have discovered is that procrastinators suffer from that. They privilege the needs, the demands of the present self over the future self. And that's what procrastination says. Procrastination, procrastinus, crastinus means tomorrow. So we move something to tomorrow. And by the way, there's a great myth around procrastination, the feeling that, oh, my life is easier if I move that to tomorrow, if I move that decision to tomorrow. We never move a decision to tomorrow, we make two decisions. Procrastination is a decision not to decide. So when we think we're making our life easier by moving a decision, we actually now have to make two decisions. Am I deciding today? And then tomorrow, what decisions will I make? So it's actually making our life more complicated, not more simple. So what we need against that breach of self-continuity, that lack of self-continuity, is more perspective on our future self. Someone wrote about that in the early 16th century. His name was Ignacio de Loyola, St. Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuit order. And his advice was quite morbid when you think about it. He said, when you struggle with a decision, imagine yourself on your deathbed, reflecting back on the decision you were struggling with. How would you feel now? And I think that's quite telling, that's quite revealing. Going to a less morbid territory, and Warren Buffett, the famous businessman, financier, he uses a technique known as the 10-10-10. You may have heard about that. Yes? So the 10-10-10 was coined by an author called Susie Welch. And this says, this decision I struggle with, if I go for this option, how will I feel about it in 10 days' time, in 10 months' time, and in 10 years' time? So this is bringing back perspective and bringing back self-continuity to our decisions. So that's the first manifestation of self-estrangement, self-continuity. The second one I want to talk to you about is what I call self-defense, because we use defense mechanisms when we don't want to decide. So one of them we've talked about, it's procrastination. So sometimes people come to me and say, look, I never procrastinate, really, so does this mean I'm a good decision maker? And unfortunately I have to say not necessarily. There's many more defense mechanisms we use when we don't want to decide. So let's look at a couple of them. And the reason I have notes is because I don't want to give you all the reasons, otherwise we'll be together for 10 hours. So one of them is mono-living. A great example of mono-living in part of his life is Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook. Why? He wears the same clothes every day. Obviously he washes them, but he's got different versions of the same clothes that he wears every day. Always grey t-shirt, black jeans. Why? Because he doesn't want to have to make that decision. It's a waste of time. So it works for him in that area. Of course, that's not the way he makes his business decisions. So the risk for all of us is, are we mono-living our lives? Do we do the things that we're familiar with? Because then we become creatures of habit. And the danger is we stop growing. So that's a question worth asking ourselves when we struggle with a decision. The second one is outsourcing. There's a hand raised at the end there. Outsourcing. This is when I'm not going to decide, I'm going to ask someone else to decide for me. So how do we feel when we ask someone else to decide for us? I'm not sure where to go for dinner tonight. Why don't you decide? We feel it's the polite thing to do. It's kind of a polite thing. It's a respectful thing. But how do we feel when we're the receiver of that message? It's an intrusion. It's an imposition. Why should I make that decision? So this is the difference between, again, sending the message, receiving the message. And the main thing about outsourcing is that it takes away our agency. As we ask other people to decide for us, we lose faith, we lose trust in our own ability to decide over time. That's something we should fight. Another defense mechanism is perfectionism. Sounds great, doesn't it, perfectionism? In every interview people say, yeah, my greatest failing, I'm a perfectionist, and they think it's okay. Actually, perfectionism in psychology is a sign of neuroticism, so it's not okay. I have a client who owns a hotel in Switzerland, and he was delighted one day. He said, we got our quality ratings 92%, which is really, really high, of course, in the hotel business. And I made this stupid joke, which I will always, a stupid comment, which I will always regret. And I said, what's wrong with the other 8%? And he said, Joe, you don't get it. In my business, if you aim for 100%, you go bankrupt within 2 years. Because then you start putting TVs in the bathroom, you know, plasma screens, the kind of things no one cares about, no one ever uses, because people are in a hurry. But you go bankrupt in the meantime. And the reason I mention this as an analogy is the risk of us becoming psychologically bankrupt when we aim for perfectionism. Because if I aim for perfectionism, I'm devoting all my energy, all my attention to one project, and I'm missing the others, the other opportunities in my life. So I'm making my life narrower. So as I said, I'm not going to go on and on with more defense mechanisms, but I do want, on the subject of perfectionism, to talk to you about Hannah Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter. And she had this very beautiful expression. She said, in our dreams, our eggs are always cooked to perfection, but we can't eat them. And that's the problem with perfectionism. It's an illusory life that we live. So why do we erect these defense mechanisms? Are you familiar? In my country, in France, there is a building called the Ligne Maginot. It's more than a building. It's a huge infrastructure around hundreds of kilometers. And it was built in 1929 by the French government to protect France from Germany, who kept invading France every 10 or 20 years. It didn't work. Because in 1940, the Germans went around the Maginot Line. So defense mechanisms can be very sophisticated. That doesn't mean they're effective. So we need to question why we use defense mechanisms. And in the case of France, the reason it erected this Maginot Line was out of fear. The fear of another invasion. So fear makes us do things which are irrational. We're in a place which is highly Jungian, and Carl Jung wrote that the spirit of evil is the negation of our life force by fear. That's what fear does to us. It stops us from living. It negates our life force. It makes our life smaller. And there's a long section in the book on that, but really I'm going to go straight to the conclusion, what shocked me, frankly, when I got to that conclusion, is that when you think of all the fears of decision-making, and I've categorized them into 7 different types of fear, ultimately, especially when there is a pattern, they are fears about the self. Every fear of a decision mirrors a fear about myself. Again, self-estrangement. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. One of the greatest fears of decision-making is, what if I choose the wrong option, right? And the way it mirrors an inner fear is, what if I am the wrong option? What if I am wrong? What if, what psychologists call the risk of defectiveness, what if I am defective? And that's the fear. If my pattern is, I may choose the wrong option, it will mirror a fear about something is wrong with me. So we need to heal that first before becoming better decision makers. Another fear is the fear of missing out, FOMO. We all know that. It's the sales at the moment, so people end up buying things they would never dream of buying if they were not in the sale, because there's one left. Happens to all of us. The fear of missing out mirrors the fear of being missed out, which is one of our two deepest fears, the fear of abandonment, which comes from childhood, being abandoned by the parents. Fear of failure, another great fear, the fear that I am a failure. So you see how all these fears of decision making mirror fear about the self, and that's worth addressing. So the next one is what I call self-splitting. Carl Jung said that decades before us, the self is complex. You cannot describe the self. If someone asks you, who are you? We're going to use a ploy, we're going to use a name, we're going to use a job, we're going to use an envelope of the self rather than the self. It's impossible to describe who we truly are. And that's because we're made of many parts. The self is made of many parts. So the problem with that is when it comes to decision making, very often different parts of me want different things. The spirits are talking. different parts of me want different things. So let's say, for example, I can't decide whether I should go on holiday next month, where I should go on holiday. That may be because one part of me genuinely wants to have fun. That's the hedonist part of me. Another part of me, the serious part of me, thinks I should be working. Another part of me thinks, you know, we only have one life, let's go big. Another part of me may think, no, actually we should be cautious. So different parts of us are fighting for that decision. And that's why Aristotle, again back in the 4th century, compared decision making with a process of deliberation in the courts of justice. And I think that's actually a very helpful tip, because when different parts of us are fighting to decide, we just need to sit them down, a bit like you guys today, to listen to all of them and to reconcile them. Next manifestation of self-estrangement is what I call self-hiding. Now, the very first question in the Bible is the question that God asks for Adam in Eden. And it's one word. In biblical Hebrew, the question is ayeka, which means, anyone? Where are you? Thank you. Fantastic to be in London, international crowd, I love it. Where are you? Well, of course, God knows where Adam is. He doesn't need a GPS, right? But does Adam know where he is? That's the question. Do you know where you are? I'm not talking about Cecil Court in your life. So, to answer that question, because we all feel from time to time when deciding, when making decisions, and especially when struggling with decisions, that we are stuck. We don't really know where we are stuck. The answer to the question, ayeka, is I don't know. So what I've tried to do is to define a geography, a cartography of decision making, and look at the chambers where we get stuck. There are 6 chambers. I'm going to mention a couple. One of them is creativity. Great decision makers are creative people. Now the problem is, we all know that we have to have several options. But what we don't all know is that we also need several objectives, in fact many objectives. I'll give you an example. There is a charity in Hungary, and that, by the way, the work done at the London School of Economics by the Department of Decision Science. There is a charity in Hungary which protects children who live in the streets. And it gives them a home, and it gives them food, and it was shocked because 25% of these children walked out when they had nothing to go to. And there was still a dropout rate of 25%. So then with the help of the decision scientists from NSC, they looked at why that was the case, and they found that the charity had in its strategy a couple of objectives. So they thought, we need to do something about that. So they then produced, with the executives in the charity, a list of 20, 30 objectives and restructured their operations as a result. The dropout rate in a very short time went from 25% to 0. And so that's how effective it is when we start thinking about more objectives. What happens when we think of one objective only? I want to go on holiday to Greece because I want to have sun. We're unhappy. We go there and we think, well, there's sun, but I hate the music. Yeah? I don't, by the way, if there's anyone Greek. I think bouzouki is beautiful. Carl Jung talked about that. He called it one-sidedness. One-sidedness is when the mind is focused on one thing only. And again, he said this is the main route to neuroticism. So we want to be careful about having too limited scope in our objectives. So as I said, a couple more chambers I'm going to talk about. The other one is selection. The selection chamber is when we have all our options on the table and we pick one. Now some people call that the decision. Of course, we now know decision is a broader concept. There's a trick, there's a technique which was in fact coined by Benjamin Franklin, the famous US statesman. And you've all used that, I'm sure. It's you draw a line, you have two columns, you have the pros and cons. Who's used that? Yeah, we've all used that. So what Benjamin Franklin did is in the pros he had about 10 maybe arguments, in the cons he had about 10 arguments, and then he would strike out arguments of same weight. So it was not numbers, it was weight. So if one argument on the left had the same weight as two arguments or three arguments on the right, he would strike all of them. So that at the end of the day there would be maybe 3 left on the left and nothing on the right, and his decision would be made. And that's the technique that Charles Darwin used when he decided whether to get married. Highly romantic thing, 19th century. Pros and cons. And actually he did marry his wife Emma, and they had 10 children together, so maybe the technique does work. But I think it's hilarious what he wrote in the column not marry, he wrote freedom to go where one likes, conversation of clever men at clubs, this was the 19th century, loss of time. In the column marry, he wrote children, if it please God, constant companion, object to be beloved and played, better than a dog anyhow, he added. Quite shocking, really, quite shocking. And then Freud comes back, obviously early 20th century. And Freud says, actually I've got his quote here, he says, when making a decision of minor importance, I've always found it advantageous to consider all the pros and cons. So Freud is saying, yes, sure, use that for minor decisions. But in vital matters, such as the choice of a mate or a profession, the decision should come from the unconscious, from somewhere within ourselves. In the important decisions of personal life, we should be governed, I think, by the deeper inner needs of our nature. So what about the unconscious? Who decides when we decide? I asked that question from the head of the Institute of Psychoanalysis. I was a mature student until last year. And I asked the question from the head of the institute. And I said, why can't people decide? What's the reason in your mind why people can't decide? And you can never get a simple answer from a psychoanalyst. Impossible. On this occasion I did. And he said, an envious superego. So I thought, okay, can you explain? And of course the superego is the part of the psyche which talks about authority. It's your parents, it's your teachers, it's anyone who is a figure of authority in your life. And when that figure of authority, dead or alive, by the way, doesn't matter, is envious of you, of your success, of your achievements, of your path, it stops you from deciding, if you let them decide. So what we want to be is autonomous, from the Greek, sorry I promised, but your own laws, autonomous decision makers. Don't let other people or other part of the psyche decide, make your own decisions. So enough on that subject. I'll just finish with the last concept, which is what I call self-ignorance. And that's when we can't read our own will. And one thing that psychologists, but especially neurologists, have discovered is that when we decide consciously, something in our mind, something in our body has already decided before we can articulate the decision. And the sequence goes from emotions to feelings to thought. So when we formulate a thought, actually somewhere in the body, somewhere in the mind, it's already been decided by an emotion, by a feeling. So the ability to read your own emotions, to read your own feelings, is essential in being able to make the right decisions. Conclusion of our proceedings. I've got 3 messages for you. The first one is still, there are times when we find ourselves in limbo. And the word limbo is interesting. In Greek, mythology, limbo is the gate to hell. It's not very encouraging, is it? So let's go there for a second. We shouldn't be afraid. There is a river called Lethe, which is the same word we find in lethargy. Lethargy. I can't pronounce that word. Can someone help? Lethargy. Lethargy is the opposite of decision making, right? It's when we can't decide, when we do nothing. And lethargy is also, lethe is also the river where if you dip into it, you forget. It's the river of forgetfulness. So lethargy, indecision, is what happens when we forget who we are. So we have to remember who we are. And remember means bring the limbs together, reform who we are. So that's the challenge in decision making. Second message, as I said, our greatest fear is making the wrong decision. One of my greatest inspirations, and you will find that in the book, is Benedict Spinoza, the 17th century Dutch philosopher, who said something so modern at the time. He said, there is no such thing as the wrong decision. The decision you make is, by definition, the right decision. The evidence of that, you made it. The other decisions, the other options, didn't make it to the end. So every decision you make follows your needs, your necessity, and is therefore the right decisions. And going straight from Spinoza to a 20th century jazz player, Miles Davis, he said, no note is right or wrong. No note you play is right or wrong. Same idea, but he added, it is the note you play after which makes it right or wrong. So again, it's not the decision we make, it's how we bounce. Last message. Despite everything we've covered today, despite all the advice in the book even, you will find sometimes yourselves in situations where it's literally 50-50. I cannot decide. Both options are equally attractive. What do I do? So you might say simply, if it's really 50-50, take any. You know, if you're consistent, if it's 50-50, take any of the two options. But you may say that's a bit flippant. So I'm going to add something, and that's my last words. These decisions where we are 50-50 literally are probably the most interesting decisions we make in our lives. That's what Ruth Chang, the American philosopher, calls normative decisions. Why? Because these are the decisions that make us who we are. This is when we choose who we want to be. And this is the magic of decision making. Thank you so much.